Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Jennifer Grueling. I'm going to talk about feedback in this video, giving feedback to your students, particularly in a first year writing classroom. A lot of this comes from my own personal practice in philosophy, but I have studied feedback and am familiar with a lot of the literature within composition about feedback. So it's also grounded in disciplinary practice. So feedback, when I say that, what I mean is comments on your students' writing, whether those comments are at the draft phase or the final phase, or whether that is written comments, video recorded comments, audio comments, or even conferences with students. There are a lot of ways to give feedback. Personally, I really value collecting drafts from students and giving feedback at that stage of the writing process when they have a chance to revise. Um, so that's something I've always done, but I realize that's difficult to do when you have large classrooms and 100 students a semester. So I think there are opportunities to guide them to give each other feedback and then use that as a jumping off point for your own feedback. I think there are ways to give them limited opportunities for feedback. I used to give you could turn in one draft during the semester of a paper, but not every single paper to me, although they did get peer feedback on every draft. So I am going to go to a paper that I gave feedback on last semester and just talk through a little bit about my comments and how I approach feedback. All right, so here I have a student paper. It is a rough draft of a rhetorical analysis paper for my first year writing class. And in this assignment, I asked them to analyze the promotional materials for Ball State for our university. So one of the things that I've come to value about feedback is starting from the point where the person who is receiving the feedback wants to start from. What do they want to do? What are their goals? Where do they need help? So now what I do is I ask my students when they submit a rough draft to put a question or two at the top for me about what they would most like feedback on. And I do go beyond that if I see other issues, but it gives us a good starting point so that it feels more like I'm responding to that person as a human being, as a student, and valuing what it is they need out of my feedback. So here this student you'll see left a couple questions for me. What can I do to lengthen my paper? And are there any points that I'm missing or didn't touch on enough? So in my end comments, you'll see in a minute, I also address those questions. So marginal comments I tend to use pretty sparingly. In a final draft, I usually don't leave marginal comments at all because they aren't going on to revise, but I do like to leave them some in a rough draft because it helps call their attention to particular pieces in the paper where they can make some changes. So to do that, in Canvas, there's buttons up here that you can add comments. I'm not sure if I'm seeing all of them right now because it's already been submitted, but there's ways to just click in the paper and leave comments. So one good practice is to work on posing questions to the student rather than giving commands. And some of this depends on your philosophy, but I think it helps build student confidence and show that they have agency over their writing. They can make the changes in a way that works for them and their style. And so this student just started this paper with in this paper I'll be analyzing, which I don't mind that kind of language, but I prefer that it doesn't, that's not the very first sentence. So my comment here was, how can you lead into this? Maybe say something more general about the college or about advertising or Ball State. And then, down here I'm asking for more specifics. She talks about the wonderful and cheerful environment, welcoming and cheerful environment in the advertisement that she's analyzing. So I said, what specifically makes it feel welcoming? So I, again, like to pose this as a question. I could have just written a word here like specifics or give example or something like that. But this is a part of my feedback style. And then I also like to try to give some praise, like I mentioned, that is specific to this paper, not just good job or yes. But like I like how you mentioned the parent here. Like this is a really good point that the student made. So that's a little bit about my marginal feedback here. I'm going to go over to my end comment now and show you more what that looks like. All right, let's take a look at my end comment here. So one of the things that I've been using Canvas for is peer review feedback. So when I went to evaluate this draft and leave some feedback, I had right above my comment the comments from the peer reviewers, which I really like. Yeah, Canvas is a little more clunky in doing that than, say, using Google Docs or something like that. So I think there's other ways that you can do the same thing with other technology. So I start with the student's name. You don't see that because I've taken it off for privacy reasons. But I start with, kind of an overall assessment. So I say, you've got a really solid draft here. Actually, I just say you have a solid draft here. I like the specific examples you give from the ads for different strategies. So I'm telling her what she did well. And then what you'll see is I make a move to interact with the feedback she's already gotten from her peer reviews. So I say, I agree with Anna, who is one of her peer reviewers, that you could vary the beginning of the sentences a little bit more. There are places where I also left some marginal comments with some questions or some specific spots that worked well. So I think that sometimes, especially when you're using Canvas or your LMS system, the students don't always know how to see the marginal comments. So I do like to point out when I've made marginal comments so they know to look for that. And again, like I said, I like to kind of support what the peer reviewer has said, or if I disagree with what the peer reviewer has said, kind of approach that too and say like, well, I think that they may have read it this way, but I think that's not particularly an important point for you in revision, or here's why I think you might want to go a different direction. So then what I do is I really hone in on what she needs to do for her revision. So I think one of the things to focus on in revision that will also make your paper longer, because if you remember, that was one of her questions to me, a very common one. How do I make this paper longer? Is the introduction and the conclusion. You jump right in, and you could say something about Ball State as a whole. I think one of the great things about the ads you picked is that they are all for different audiences. So you might want to focus in both the introduction and the conclusion. Make that a focus. The conclusion seems more about whether or not you were convinced, but you aren't looking for graduate or online program right now. How did those ads reach different audiences? So she had chosen 3 ads. One was for graduate programs, one was for online programs, which was a great pick to see the diversity in audiences, but also she's approaching the conclusion from a very personal angle, which again is something I've seen a lot. But she's not actually looking for those programs right now. So I wanted to kind of get her thinking out of her own opinions on these ads to how they were addressing the audiences that they were intended to. All right, next I'll show you how this played out in her final draft. All right, so I've talked about some feedback I gave on a student who did well in my class, who responded to the feedback I gave, who was a pretty strong writer to begin with. So I do want to show some other examples of students who are working at different levels, come in with different backgrounds or, have different constraints on their writing. So this was a draft, and it was an okay draft. Off screen, I wrote, "You have a good start here." And I think you got a lot of helpful peer review feedback. So I'm saying like, yeah, you did something. I acknowledge that you're on the right track, but this person has farther to go, more to work on. So I still frame it with some praise. In the beginning, I think the strongest part of your paper was the part about the campus tour. I really liked what you were saying about identity and belonging. Perhaps that theme is something to bring into the paper as a whole more, especially the intro and the conclusion. So instead of just pointing out that a particular part is good, I wanted to show how they could apply that to other parts of their paper, how they could take that idea and pull it out more in their writing and focus on it. So I'm really starting with what they're doing well and how they can build on that. Then I'm responding to a reader about something that really confused me. They were studying this ad that Ball State sent where it was a happy birthday video, and I wasn't at all clear whether it was a part of Ball State's 100th anniversary birthday celebration for the university or whether it was wishing students a happy birthday, like some companies will send things on your birthday, right? So I explained that confusion in the next paragraph, that I wasn't clear about it as a reader. So I'm not necessarily saying like, this is all wrong, redo it, but just like, hey, I'm confused. I'm not clear what's happening here. It's really fascinating that you picked this ad, but I need more setup as a reader to understand that. So let's see how he responded to feedback. Again, the student actually did a great job here, and when I went to look at their final draft, I went back to the feedback I gave, and I noticed that comment about the birthday ad. I might not have remembered that detail, but since I went back, I saw that, and they clarified it. So I started my feedback here by saying the details you added really helped me understand these ads more. Again, I'm talking like as a reader. I didn't understand this in your first draft. You supported your claims about the effectiveness of the ads and helped me picture it. I now get that it was a birthday, the birthday was Ball State's birthday. So clarified it, added some good things. One of the things I wanted to show this particular feedback for was the issue of grammar. So a lot of times people have questions about when they should comment on grammar, when they shouldn't. This particular student struggled with grammar. However, it's in my philosophy that I'm not really going to grade on grammar, but you'll notice they do have a marginal comment here. You don't need a period here. This is a fragment, right? So I wanted to make it clear to the student in my commentary that this was an area for improvement, but also not something that I was going to affect their grade on. So I'm not grading on grammar, but if it's something you'd like to work on, I noticed that you write with a lot of fragments. You also sometimes capitalize words that don't need to be, like identity. These are things you might consider working on in the next paper if that's a goal for you. So I'm giving the student the agency there. If it were more my goal as a teacher to focus on that, then I might word that comment differently, but since I was particularly using contract grading, this was a 103 class, very beginning, I wanted to help the student grow in that area, but also not fail them for those kind of mistakes at this point in the course. All right, final example I want to show you. This student was a little bit more middle of the road, did a pretty good job. But also didn't respond to all of my feedback. So here's how I addressed that. So just scroll up a little so you can see the beginning of this comment. You did a good job adding in a bit about Kairos, including your paper. So there, she did make some improvement in those areas. I didn't see much in the way of revision throughout the paper though. Most of it was already pretty strong, but I think you could have done more to bring in the terminology from class. For example, in your draft, I used marginal comments to point out what the spatial mode and some other details. While you didn't have to change anything there, definitely look more at the marginal comments next time to see if there's anything to tweak in the main body of your draft. So again, I'm leaving the agency to the student. That was particularly important to me in this class where they're beginning to grow as writers and develop that agency. But I also want to say like, hey, I mentioned this thing. I said these things in class. So I'm trying to do that in a way that isn't me being annoyed, even though probably I am a little annoyed that she didn't pay attention to that. But just kind of calls her attention to that and lets her know for the rest of the class, because this was the first paper, that's the type of feedback I'm giving and that these things we're doing in class are really important for when they're writing their projects. So I do like to reference those types of things sometimes in my comments so that they see how everything fits together. So they see that when we went over those terms like the spatial mode in class and the readings, like that was something that I hoped to see in their papers. And then in her case, I had even pointed out like where I thought she could incorporate that in her draft. All right, so that's a little bit about how I give feedback, or a lot about how I give feedback. I just wanted to summarize this video with a few final thoughts about giving feedback to your students. Your feedback always exists within the context of your classroom. That's really important for me. So I was giving feedback on a rough draft with the context being that they would revise that draft for their final and that they had received peer review feedback. So I responded to that context. In addition, it was within the context of a course that I was using contract grading. So they were given my contract, they were going to get a higher grade if they did more in terms of revision. So that's an important piece of the context to know. In addition, you saw me responding to context such as what I had gone over in the classroom, the comments I'd given in the rough draft when they either built on those for the final draft or they didn't. So all of that really affects my feedback, as well as the fact that this is their very first course, probably at the university, their very first writing course, and I want to build their confidence at this point. And that was also an important part of my feedback and the way that I worded that feedback and the way that I stress their own agency in terms of developing their writing. So feedback is really an important part of your teaching that I think interacts with everything else that you do. It communicates a strong message about your philosophy to your students, about what you value, and how you interact with their work. I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any questions about giving feedback or particular examples you would like to discuss, feel free to reach out. Thanks so much.